Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Hello and welcome to another edition of Musical Talk. I'm Thos and if you disagree, I have to tell you it is necessarily so. And I think that probably gives you a clue as to what today's episode is going to be about, because today we're going to hear the middle section of a long conversation I had with the very excellent noted composer Colm Molloy, where we discussed three musicals: 42nd Street from 1933, followed by Porgy and Bess from 1935, and then Caroline or Change, a much more recent show. And you'll be hearing about Caroline or Change and our thoughts on that excellent and wonderful musical next week. But this week we're concentrating, as you'll have worked out as a matter of deduction, on Porgy and Bess, the monumental George Gershwin opera from 1935. An important piece of musical theatre from the 20th century. I include opera in the world of musical theatre for this purpose. And of course a very important piece of music in the life of George Gershwin. In fact, I was very surprised to discover that in 1935, the year of Porgy and Bess, there are no other songs attributed to George Gershwin composed in that year. He was so concentrating on getting his opera right that he really didn't have time for anything else, and he certainly wasn't producing any film music or shows for Broadway. Porgy and Bess is an important opera, and it is a strange sort of halfway house for the lover of musical theatre, because the show has sometimes been transformed into a stage production which is more akin to musical theatre, and indeed came to London many years ago as Porgy and Bess the Musical. But more recently it was at the ENO, the English National Opera, at the Coliseum, in a full operatic version. And it was a show that I got to see. Now, I am no lover of opera per se, although I appreciate it perhaps more than enjoy it. But of course the score of Porgy and Bess has what can only really be described as musical numbers rather than arias. There are plenty of arias, plenty of things that we would recognise as being from an opera, but there are a few belter songs interpolated into it, it ain't necessarily so being one of them. That it also has those musical theatre flavours, as I say. And for any lover of Gershwin, there's plenty to find in the score of Porgy and Bess to enjoy, even if you're not a fan of opera. And that is exactly the position from which I came at it. And similarly, Colm Molloy, although he has a much broader range of musical references and areas of enjoyment, and indeed a brow which is considerably higher than mine, I can tell you, he also finds opera problematic in some ways. But both of us really enjoyed the London production of Porgy and Bess, which is not to say it was without its flaws. But to say any more at this stage, I think, would be to preempt the conversation, and there's really no point in doing that when the conversation is an enjoyable thing to listen to in its own right. So, I'm now going to be quiet and allow you to hear that conversation that I had with Colm Molloy, where we moved from 42nd Street, the conversation that you heard last week, into the discussion of Porgy and Bess, and specifically the recent full opera version at the ENO in London. Musical Talk, the UK's independent musical theatre podcast. Well, that's 1933 sorted out.
So we're moving 2 years forward?
We are, yes. You read my mind, that's right. We're doing Porgy and Bess.
Yeah.
Obviously, that came to London last year in its opera form.
Yep.
The first time it's been in London for something like 40 years in its opera form, and the first time it's ever been done at the English National Opera, the ENO. Interestingly, I noticed it's also a joint production with a Dutch opera company and the Met in New York, and it's going on to the Met shortly, this very production. And it has casts from all over the world, so it's not part of the ENO repertory.
No.
So, Porgy and Bess, obviously you know your Gershwin.
I do.
How well did you know Porgy before you went in?
I had seen it a few years ago when it was done at the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre, which I believe was the same production that transferred from Broadway around a similar time. Was that 2012? I mean, I could be completely wrong.
No, it certainly was there a few years ago, yeah.
I seem to believe that's the same production that was just transferred with an English cast. I also believe it was the Pothold production that caused outrage in West 49th Street, where Sondheim lives, who was very annoyed that whoever had adapted this had bastardised it and transformed it into this shorter, sweeter production of Gershwin. I believe that. I could be completely wrong, but that was the first production I saw.
Better than the non-black one that was in Hungary recently, which really did put their noses out of joint.
Yeah.
It was reimagined as being in a refugee centre.
Oh.
Yeah, quite. I think you can push the envelope too far sometimes.
Yeah. Gosh. Okay. But I also know it from having listened a fair deal to a Simon Rattle recording.
Yeah.
Of what date, I have no idea, but it is the whole opera.
And then how long does that last? It's a good few hours.
I think a good 3 hours and a bit. And then there's also the Trevor Nunn production from a while ago that is about on YouTube somewhere. Yeah.
I went to see that with Tim Saywood.
I see.
That's the one that was, I believe it was called The Gershwin's Porgy and Bess, and was also
Heathens.
Yeah, and subtitled Porgy and Bess, sort of the musical, because it was a musicalised version.
Oh.
Between you and me, I didn't think that one worked. I'd never seen it as an opera. So this for me was an eye-opener.
Yeah, I hadn't either. And I mean, we've spoken a lot about opera, and we have our
interests.
We have our I was going to say we have our problems with it. I don't think Porgy and Bess is immune to those problems.
No.
And what I went into Porgy and Bess with on this occasion were the same preconceptions that I normally have, unfortunately, when I tend to go and see opera, which is that the focus tends to be very music heavy.
Indeed.
And
yes.
as a result, things such as dramaturgy, acting, and even just justification of, the prime example would be the opening scene where you're really just meant to have one woman singing Summertime.
Yeah.
But in this production, they had chosen to have the whole cast on stage, and they had, remind me the name of the
Catfish Row.
Catfish Row. You essentially saw the
on
whole
Thames.
of Catfish Row frozen, I think against a gauze, or maybe the gauze wasn't there, whilst this lone woman sang at Summertime. And for me, it didn't work. It's kind of revealing your tricks too early,
yeah.
And it's making something which is a very vast show, and opera is vast anyway, but it's neglecting to use the opportunity where it could be so small and focused on this one person,
and then grow out into the community.
Absolutely.
Gilbert Strick, funnily enough, from Yeoman of the Guard. You know,
oh, really?
One of their last musicals, the serious one of the Gilbert and Sullivans, for want of a better phrase. But it took a big risk when it was written in the 1880s, because unlike all other opera and operetta at the time, it didn't start with a chorus number. It started with a single woman on the stage singing a song on her own, I think with a spinning wheel. A beautiful song, by the way. I also think Sullivan and Gilbert together really came out the goods, but what it does exactly what you say. You know, suddenly the audience, instead of being offered a spectacle, they're offered an individual with a song that means something, rather than just a kind of, here we all are in X town. So you immediately are drawn to the person, and then from the person, even though she's not the main character in the piece by any means, she's just she's
a motif of...
Exactly. She's part of the community, but it suddenly centres you in a human story, rather than the spectacle in which human stories are taking place, which is 42nd Street in a strange way.
Yeah.
So I agree with you, and this production did that.
Yeah, again, it was surprising.
Well, it didn't do that. It did what you just described, which is the fact that she was still in the heart of her community rather than bringing you into it.
For sure. And I don't think it's I think it's an old trope now, starting a show with a solo character on stage.
Oh, yeah.
Oklahoma being the prime example.
Yeah.
So I was surprised that was how they decided to start the show. But then, given my proclivity for not enjoying opera so much, I wasn't surprised that was how it was done. Things. I mean, why don't we let's take a step back and maybe go to the things that I did like.
Yes.
It's great to hear the score at any opportunity.
Oh, it's soaring Gershwin.
Yeah, and I do think it's perhaps Gershwin at his very best. There is so much musically that you can hear going on, which is possibly a precursor to what he would have written had he not died when he did, how many years later? 2 years later.
Yeah, 37 years.
Which is both tragic but also incredibly... I think it makes his score stand out against the songs he had written in the 20s as well. He seems like he was transforming into something, at least. There's so much of Wagner in that, and there's so much of other things as well, Strauss and other opera composers, Kurt Weill.
This is Richard Strauss, I think you're thinking.
Yes.
Yes, exactly. It's really interesting you saying that, because obviously I'm a great fan of his Tin Pan Alley work, or his shows and films, as it was towards the end. After that he was really into Hollywood. The George Gershwin scores for Shall We Dance with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers and a few other shows. And I think you can actually just see a sea change in his speech marks normal songwriting. I think they become slightly more sumptuous and broader in scope. They sort of escaped Tin Pan Alley into... They're still great melodies, which is actually one of his great gifts, but they are done with... there's a kind of greater depth going on. I think you can actually also see it in Ira as well, the lyricists, because I know that Porgy and Bess is Dubose Hayward with Ira Gershwin, and I think it's fairly easy to see where the Ira Gershwin numbers are. I'm guessing It Ain't Necessarily So is more Ira than it is Dubose.
I think so.
But I do think that you can see that it changed him as a standard songwriter, and exactly, I think if he'd gone on to live, we'd be seeing Gershwin version 2, which is the move away from shows and films into opera and sub-opera. And I think we would be talking about Gershwin as Rodgers and Hammerstein rather than Rodgers and Hammerstein. Myself, I think that's where that strand... If you'd done the second one, I think we'd be saying, and then Rodgers and Hammerstein took the Gershwin idea. But there's only one.
Yeah, how interesting. Much in
my view, that is.
No. There are lots of people Kurt Weill kind of fell into that, not trap, but that's what happened to his style when he moved to Hollywood, or to America anyway. He moved from this Brechtian, very European Weimar-sounding style to something that was more American. I think, I'm not so much a fan of it, but it was different anyway.
One Touch of Venus. Yeah, exactly. Yes, there's good stuff in there.
But yes, I think the opportunity to hear the music is one reason to go and see Porgy and Bess. And it wasn't as doctored a version as I think the open air theatre. I'm not too sure, maybe you can...
Well, I can't answer that except to say it went on until about 11 o'clock.
It did.
So it's still it felt like a long version.
Yes.
But Tim said he thought it was shorter than the full version.
Yeah,
so it may have been a halfway house.
Sure. I do think the full version is probably, 4 hours or so?
I believe it was on the original opening night. It ran to 4.5 or something like that.
Okay.
So it was trimmed, but not enough to make it a short opera.
No.
Which it isn't.
No. But I think sometimes those kinds of operas do need to be in their full length anyway.
Oh,
yeah. So I went in with those preconceptions.
Well, can I ask, just before we leave the music part, John Wilson was conducting.
He was.
And John Wilson, of course, has an affinity with the great composers of the 1930s anyway, and has done Gershwin albums from the other end of Gershwin song catalogue, as it were. And, of course, he's an amazing conductor. I mean, I always feel forced to mention this, but he made Sullivan Come Alive in the Opera North version of Radical a few years ago at the Barbican. I was delighted by that. He can breathe life. Not that it needs that much life any of it, but he can breathe an extra layer of life into a lot of already fairly solid, bouncy up, whatever they are, works. Strong pieces.
Yeah.
Just get an extra level with John Wilson. He seems to have. He's obviously a top grade. Well, he is a top grade.
He is
conductor,
very much so.
Did you have a view on?
No,
Wilson?
I think it showed in how together everything was. There are elements of Porgy and Bess that are musical theatre as well as being operatic, and
mostly sporting life.
Yeah, and he managed to straddle both of those spheres equally well.
Now, I think we need to park a little something before we go any further. There's always going to be a problem with Porgy and Bess, which is a show about black culture written by a white man, or a series of white men, based on a play by a white man. Even though it was researched in its time, Dubose Hayward didn't just pull it out of his imagination.
No.
And indeed Gershwin did research in the area where it's set, and listened to spirituals being sung by black choirs in various congregations. But it is that. It also has the 1930s attitudes which were associated with it. So it's certainly not a directly negative piece about the black community, and it's very clear that the white characters who only turn up occasionally in it are not nice people.
No. So
it's not. It's sympathetic. It just maybe not very realistic, I think, is the way I would say it. But I think we just have to take it on the value. We have to accept that because that is what it is.
I think so.
We part that, and then we say, right, is this a good work of art in the production we've seen? And I'm also going to say I share all your concerns about opera as a form, and therefore anything that's presented to me as an opera will have to overcome those. And I think you put it beautifully when you said essentially the issue is that it's music first and other things second.
Yeah.
So we both came out of it with mixed feelings, I think, didn't we?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Not that we saw it together. But.
No, we didn't. Oh, I think on the whole there were surprisingly some good performances. I think of all the operas I have seen, it was the best acting in tandem with singing that I perhaps have seen before, which was a nice change. What I didn't get, which I wanted to get and which I very much felt when I saw the Regent's Park Open Air Theatre production, was any kind of empathy towards any of the characters, particularly Bess, which I think who is, I guess, the more put upon of all the characters.
She's got a very curious journey as Bess, actually. Yeah. And she's quite a cipher, isn't she? I mean, she doesn't... As a character, she knows that her strength is probably to attach herself to the man with the greatest influence, which is why actually then her connection with Porgy is so odd. But I suppose he provides her with the one thing she genuinely craves, which is stability.
Yes.
But she's very easily led. You know, she's not a strong woman.
No.
And there's no way of dressing her up as a strong woman, really.
She's also, again, something I didn't feel... She is dependent on... Well, what I got from the other production is substance abuse, which is something that wasn't... what I think was brushed over, perhaps, in this production, and perhaps more painted her as a woman who needed the stability of a strong man, or even just a crippled man, rather than here is someone who can help ameliorate your addiction problems.
You're right. The problem with drug use in this production, at least, is that it is it's a throwaway plot device, actually. It's not addressed, it's not the issue, even. It's just a method by which she can be led from one person to another.
Yeah.
The flip side to that is, I thought that he was the most successful Porgy. I thought he was the most successful Porgy I'd come across. I enjoyed the actor, Eric... can't remember his name. Eric Green I got in my head, so if that's not right, I apologise. But I thought his performance was nicely subtle, actually, and sympathetic. You feel his despair as clearly a strong man with a crippled body.
Yeah.
You know, if he hadn't been crippled, he would be a big old labourer of some variety, bashing rocks and things like that. You know, he's got physical power, as indeed the plot shows later on.
Yeah.
He's also got tenderness in a way that you perhaps might not expect. So I think he's a man of many surprises, and I thought the performance brought out the different layers of Porgy in a way that made him successfully sympathetic, because I haven't always felt sympathetic for Porgy, because sometimes you're just supposed to feel sorry for the cripple, if that makes... You know, it's a harsh thing to say, but...
Sure.
And I thought that actually he made you feel sympathy for the character, and I felt that Porgy was actually the most successfully rounded, realised character in it. The problem for me with Porgy and Bess is that some of the strands don't go anywhere, and I don't know if that's because some of the things have been filleted. You know, there's some strong emotional stuff in there. There's some heavy meat. There's the funeral right at the beginning of the man who's murdered by Crown.
Yeah.
And that goes on and on and on. And it's a fine piece of music. I'm not sure it really takes us anywhere plot-wise, and then it's sort of barely mentioned again.
Yeah.
I suppose what it does, it sets Crown up as a villain, but there's a lot of time spent in the lamentation. Then later on, the fishing crew go and never come back when there's a storm, and it's almost never mentioned again.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, we've lost most of the men of the village. Dum-de-dum. Isn't that bad?
Yeah.
As you say, Bess isn't up to it, but there were a couple of things I didn't like, and I'd like to dispose of them before we get on to the things I really did like. It's an opera in English.
Yeah.
And yet the diction was not sufficiently good for me not to have to use these subtitles or surtitles quite a lot of the time.
Sure.
And I found that disturbing. I have to be dragged up to look at the matrix board that is giving you the surtitles in English
advance
for an English
saying.
production. Yeah, exactly. You can read ahead, so you're already dislocating yourself from the action. Unfortunately, the surtitles were in the slightly sort of patoisy English, by which I mean, the devil in It Ain't Necessarily Slow is the devil, and it's on the surtitles, and you think, well, actually, I suppose you can say, well, we're being authentic to the original script, and that's fine, but that felt a little disconnecting to me as a sort of modern audience. So I didn't like the diction, and I'm going to say the biggest problem for me was in most cases the acting, which you've already identified was a lesser consideration. Normally, actually, in the action scenes, there are a number of murders in the piece, and they were not convincing. I don't need them to be absolutely convincing, but bearing in mind the piece is played fairly realistically, or attempting to be.
Yeah.
The slightly pantomime-esque performances we were offered, and I said to Tim Saywood in the interval, or one of the intervals, I said to him, that first murder that Crown commits, I said, I didn't quite buy the action sequence. It looked very much by numbers and was done a little bit in slow motion. And I said, it's a pity about the acting. And he said, yes, but he said opera singers are expensive and delicate. And I suppose there is that, but then again, this is a form of theatre. I know it's not musical theatre, it's opera. We cut it some slack.
Maybe Gershwin could go Greek and they could murder them off stage.
Oh, I see.
That would be one way to save the actors.
When you said go Greek, I got a very different reading on that. So those were the two things I found most disturbing, and I do agree with you. I think Bess is an undercooked character in the narrative, and you therefore do need to be able to bring that out in some way, which I thought the Porgy actor brought out Porgy, but I didn't think the Bess actress was able to bring out Bess to the full. Which is not to say I didn't enjoy it. Compared to the Trevor Nunn, which is the last one I saw, I thought this was head and shoulders above the Trevor Nunn. I thought the quality of the singing, the soundscape being offered, not just by the orchestra but by the performers, was amazing. And I loved some of the design choices. I thought, bearing in mind that Catfish Row is a small community and they're all living in fairly, cheek by jowl in houses, I love the fact that you could see into each of the houses. There were no walls, so although it was a revolving set and you were seeing the housing estate, for want of a better phrase, from lots of different angles. By not having clear walls and being able to see into all the rooms, you figuratively understood that this was a community that lived in each other's pockets and there were no secrets from anyone. And I quite like the illusion that the design was able to enhance a community and the way that community lived. So for you, what was the best bit and what was the worst bit? Let's binarise this, he said, creating a new word, which I'm never going to use again.
Good. Well, we'll start with the worst bit, I think. I think it would have to be... where I was sat, I couldn't see the surtitles anyway, but I think surtitles on an English production where you would hope you would have performers who could, despite... I'm not sure if they were wearing mics, maybe you can remind me.
That I wouldn't be able to say, no.
It's a bit... Sometimes they don't with operas and sometimes they do. So if they weren't... it's hard to sing to a space that big and to get across what you're singing. But it was a shame that they had to rely on surtitles anyway.
It's the curse of the operatic style of singing, though, isn't it? Because
it is.
It's all, it's not with the mouth. It's you're shaping your mouth, and it's all coming from the diaphragm. Absolutely,
it is.
That doesn't make for clear diction anyway. It makes for a beautiful sound.
Yeah.
But those sounds aren't necessarily quite correlating with words.
No, quite. Well, that would be my least favourite part. Favourite part would have to be just listening to the score, really, and chorus singing on the whole was pretty good. I can't fault it.
And they did have a little bit of projection, didn't they? The storm and the weather conditions, you've got a sense of the sultry heat at the beginning, although I think I might be now hardwired into hearing the summertime and thinking that, just because I've heard summertime done so very many times, but when the storm was brewing up, you also got the sense of it being a muggy storm. I don't know, I assume somehow or other there was stuff coming off the stage which I thought was good stagecraft.
Yeah.
Now here's a question. Historically, the songs in an opera are arias.
Yes.
Is It Ain't Necessarily So, Oh Lord, I'm on my way, I'm going to use it, speaking as a person who's more musically theatre-minded than opera-minded, can you say that the clear Gershwin songs in the piece are arias, or are there Gershwin songs in a music, in an opera?
That's such a picky question.
It is, which is why I'm asking you to answer it and not me.
Oh, thanks. Well, one could conceive of what Gershwin was doing as being transforming a musical or trying to straddle those two worlds, and in doing so songs such as It Ain't Necessarily So and Summertime are arias in some sense, but with that musical theatre undertone of the 1930s. I'm trying to think if I can think of a comparison. I don't think it's a stretch of the imagination to think of standalone musical theatre songs as arias or operatic, especially if the melodramatic stakes are high. I don't know.
Is
Rose's Turn an aria? It is in some sense, isn't it?
Is the Phantom of the Opera, when you sing the Phantom of the Opera is here, I mean, it's all cod opera, but is it an aria?
I don't know.
I mean, in exactly the same way, is Rose's Turn an aria?
Yeah. I mean, what would we go... Edward Albee, at the end of A Delicate Balance, calls Tobias's speech an aria in the stage directions, which it is not an aria.
No.
Given that it's spoken. But I can see why he would call it an aria, metaphorically at least. What is an aria is the question. And I think it is melodrama to a degree. It doesn't have to be realistic, but it can be psychologically real, I suppose.
Well, it's funny, and we'll talk about company on another occasion, but I always think being alive is not actually earned by the piece, but it's almost an aria, because in the definition you've just given, that actually it on its own sets up the terms by which it needs to be interpreted, almost. If that makes any kind of sense, I suppose. I'm sure we'll discuss that again. So, all in all, a valiant effort, a lot to like, a lot that could perhaps be tidied up a little bit. I'm interested to see how it gets picked up in New York and beyond. But I'm very glad I saw it.
Me too.
But it's a flawed masterpiece, I suppose, at the end of the day. I'm not just talking about the production, I'm talking about the show in its own right.
Yeah, I'm sad to admit that I probably agree, though I would like the show to be flawless.
Well, yes.
And I don't know, I think there's room for improvement. I think all it needs is somebody to be brave enough to stage the whole 4.5 hours, really. I feel I wouldn't be surprised if what stops the show from being as successful as it is a reduced production, but not reduced enough. So you say 3.5 hours, you still feel like
fish nor fowl.
You probably feel like that was a bit too long, but really it just probably wasn't long enough to give you the entire depth. You feel like you've had a meal, but the last course was rushed or something.
Yes, I do, you've been told they've turned the oven off, so you can't have a pudding.
Yeah, we don't serve coffee at this time.
Yeah. I think we have had some similar circumstances. I will just say, Tim Sayward said he thought the actor playing Crown was the best Crown he'd ever seen. He got the real menace from Crown, and I do think that actor did perform the menace. Yeah. My problem is and I have to say, we have to, funny enough, and it's just come back to me now, there is a rape scene.
There is.
Crown rapes Bess by keeping her away when everyone else has gone home from their day out.
Yeah.
And we end that scene with Crown dropping his trousers, which oddly, I think, does not... Which feels... My view is that that's actually almost too gimmicky for what's going on the stage. I know it signifies a sexual act to drop your trousers. There's a glistening buttock. But actually, you go away with the memory of the glistening buttock, which is rather than remembering or realising or allowing the import of what you're actually seeing and how under the control of everyone poor Bess is.
Yeah.
Gosh, sorry about that.
No.
Musical talk. And there we are, Colin Malloy and me talking about Porgy and Bess. And of course, next week we'll be moving on to Caroline or Change, so do join us again for that. Now, George Gershwin is, as you know, one of the most important composers of musical theatre in the 20th century, but I always find that his scores are so dynamic that they are not in any way period pieces, even though he died before the Second World War. He has written music which I think is totally evergreen. But it is therefore surprising to realise that here in 2021, we are more than a century away from the beginning of his career and the fact that he was already becoming famous. His big first hit was Swanee in 1919, but of course he'd actually written his first score in 1917. What was he doing in 1921, a century ago? Well, he was writing, amongst other things, a musical called A Dangerous Maid, and I think it represents that strange period in the first 20 years of the 20th century, where the legacy of Gilbert and Sullivan cast a long shadow on musical theatre, We know that musical theatre was becoming freer and easier and escaping its operetta roots, and George M. Cohan had a lot to do with that. But let's not forget that Florodora was the great hit of 1899 and was still being regularly revived on both sides of the Atlantic for 20 and 30 years into the 20th century. So there was still a taste for that more historic, what we would now, I think, recognise as an Edwardian style musical. And A Dangerous Maid is precisely that. It's more backward-looking than forward-looking, and only one of its songs has ever really stood out, and that's the song Boy Wanted, which was written 100 years ago. Now, the thing about Boy Wanted is that it's the song which clearly sounds like later Gershwin, in a score which sounds like retrogressive Gershwin. And I think that's the thing that makes it stick out. The song also had a life after the show, because A Dangerous Maid is one of the few shows by George Gershwin that never got as far as Broadway. And so Boy Wanted was taken out of the show, and in 1924, 3 years later, and with slightly revised lyrics, was placed in the British Gershwin musical called Primrose. But the thing that's most interesting, I think, about A Dangerous Maid is, although it was George Gershwin's second solo score, it was the first one where he worked exclusively with his brother Ira Gershwin, although Ira was using a pseudonym, which was Arthur Francis, which he'd picked up by taking the names of his brother and his sister, Arthur and Francis. So another milestone in the development of the Gershwins as a writing partnership, heading towards Lady Be Good in 1924, for example, and then an unrivalled success for another 10 to 15 years of great musicals, which culminated, I suspect we can at least argue in some way, in Porgy and Bess, which we've just discussed. Now, I was very surprised that there are very few easy-to-find parodies of Porgy and Bess. I thought there would be hundreds. And in fact, the only thing I can really find is a rather charming little parody called Dinner Time and the Chicken is Greasy by somebody called Mick Terry, and you can find those lyrics online if you look for them. But actually, the thing about Porgy and Bess, which has been picked up by parodists and satirists, is the title of the show. If you've heard of the British Carry On films, you may be interested to know that in the early 1970s they also had a television series, and one of the episodes of that series was called Porgy and Bess. But it's a joke which had already been minted and had been used by Flanders and Swan in their 1953 review, Airs on a Shoestring, because they'd written a song for that called Guide to Britain, by which they meant a guide to Benjamin Britten, which took a rather amusing, if affectionate, swipe of the great British composer Benjamin Britten. And they reference his then new opera, it's all circular this, if we get back to opera, Gloriana. And in their song A Guide to Britain, when talking about the opera Gloriana, there is the wonderful couplet, but Gloriana was a social success. It turned out a regular orgy. And Bess. And then Donald Swan, who was writing the music for that and being a great parodist, also picked up, as you would expect, the sounds of Gershwin and an extract of the music from Porgy and Bess, which goes to show what a legacy that Gershwin had 15 years after he died. And let's remember, in a different country. George Gershwin was quite rightly venerated in America as one of their great writers, but also much appreciated in the United Kingdom. And that continues to this day, as both Colm and I are still enormous fans of George Gershwin, and I can find happiness in almost any selection of George Gershwin's songs. I do have a tendency towards his Tin Pan Alley and musical scores over his operatic stuff and the orchestral pieces, but there isn't anything he's written that I don't enjoy. And if you don't know George Gershwin, it might be worth having a look, and probably more importantly, having a hear. Well, that's it for this week. I think we've covered Porgy and Bess as well as we're going to do. And if I can offer my own very small parodic reworking of the title, this orgy of self-congratulation about how much we loved Gershwin has turned into a mess. And I think, as it's not a very good joke, that's where I'm going to say goodbye. Goodbye. This episode of Musical Talk presented by Thos and Colm Malloy, and edited by Thos Ribbits. Copyright Musical Talk 2021. To find out more about the world of Musical Talk and listen to past episodes, go along to our website www.musicaltalk.co.uk or subscribe to us on iTunes, and follow us on Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can, at Musical Talk Thos. I was going to say, do you mind not tapping the table if it's possible? And when you're scraping the table, that will come out on the record. So occasional taps.
Sorry.
I'm so sorry, because you're animated, and I do apologise. But when
right.
you started doing that, I thought that is actually going to sound like someone's drawing on the microphone.
No, well, yeah.
My apologies.
No,
I'm so
that's
sorry.
all right.
Soaring Gershwin.
Yes. Hang on. Lost my thought.
Sorry.
No. What was I trying to say? Oh, bother.
You said it was Gershwin at his very best.
Yes, I do think it's Gershwin at his best, and what you can hear in the score is potentially
the London production of Porgy and Bess, which is not to say it was it wasn't to say it at all, apparently.